Toyota, Toyota, Toyota. Slik starter denne låta. Ja, låta, ja, låta. Hiace kommer nå.
Today I'm installing a 2-inch lift kit on the rear shackles of my 91 Hiace, and shout out to Danny from Van Life Northwest for this lift kit. The current ride height is about 3.5 inches of clearance from the tire to the top of that wheel arch. As you can see there, it's kind of sagged down a bit. And with this kit installed, it's about 5.25, so just under 2 inches. There's definitely an increase in clearance and the ride height. So this kit did not come with the upper bushings for the body on the rear shackles, so I picked them up from JDM Cruisers in Armstrong, BC. It might not be completely necessary to replace those top bushings, but this van is 30 years old and rubber parts crack out and dry. So if I'm going to do this amount of work, take that all off, I'm going to replace them while I'm in there so that there's no problems in the future. So to get started, I just jacked up the rear differential housing with the floor jack, and I put a rag under it so that it would have a little bit of cushion there so it wouldn't scratch anything or mess anything up. And as I'm going, I'm using some 6x6 fur blocking that I just had around, and I'm cribbing up underneath the rear hitch just to add another layer of protection and support, so this is going to be as stable as it can possibly be while I'm under there working and wrenching on things and, you know, really applying a lot of force to get some of these bolts off. I don't want the thing to come down on me. I'm blocking the front wheels with these chocks that are from my tool trailer, and also putting these jack stands in for support immediately in front of the wheels as close as I can get them to where I'm working without them interfering. I've also got the van in 4-wheel drive with the park brake on. Once I've got the wheel off, I let the jack down to take off some of that pressure and let it rest on the tire on the side I'm not working on, and put a smaller jack stand under the axle on the side I'm working on so that I have room under there to work and so that the axle doesn't completely go down too low. I give a shot of PB Blaster to all these bolts on the bottom and the top of the shocks, on the rear spring shackles, and where they mount to the body. That helps to loosen these bolts, especially under the U-bolt seat. Those were really stuck, so I made sure that I sprayed them. And then also the front spring bracket, and these two just for good measure, where the brake cable retaining piece is on there. Those 12mm came off pretty easy, but try not to break any bolts, so a little bit of lubricant always helps. And I'll start by pulling off the shocks. I had to use an extension up there to get around my fuel line for my heater. They come up pretty easy. I just replaced them maybe a year and a half ago or a year ago, and they're a little sticky on the bottom. And this one came off pretty easy. I did a separate video on how to remove the fuel tank to give you access under here. I can't imagine doing it without that. It would be a nightmare to get in there. And this exhaust is going to be in the way, so I'm going to have to drop that down later. And like I said, these were really hard to get off, so I had to use the big bar on those to break them. And they were really tight, and even after that I used impact a little bit on them, but they were stuck. And that last one there came down a little ways, and then I had to use a ratchet to get it out because it was, like I said, really stuck and rusted up. My little 3/8 impact wouldn't do it, and I couldn't fit the 1/2-inch one under there. But that's how it goes when you're doing something like this on the ground without a lift. So that came off. That's a little rusty and corroded there, so I'm going to file that off later before I put it back on. And just drop the tailpipe down a little bit. This gives me access to both those bolts on that side of the shackle. And this top one did not want to come. I just rounded off the nut. There was no way to get that out, so I just cut it from behind with the angle grinder. Like I said, I couldn't imagine doing this with the fuel tank still on. It'd be not possible to get in with the angle grinder like this. You'd have to use a Sawzall, or I don't know how you'd even do it. I'll put a link to that video on how I removed the fuel tank at the top there. That was sort of a separate project all on its own. And that went pretty smooth. Bang. A little persuasion, that thing came right off. And then I just pounded these bolts through to the other side. A little more PB Blaster, grease the wheels a bit. And with the hammer and my punch here, I was able to punch those all the way through with no problem. And I'll pull those rubber bushings out and see what they look like. 30-year-old rubber bushings. And I was correct. They're pretty cracked, pretty trashed, so I'm really glad that I picked up a new set of those. You can see how rusted and corroded it is in there, why those nuts don't even come off. And there's a comparison between the old one and the new one. And it's about 2 inches difference from that bolt to that bolt. And there's the parts number of the bushings. They look to be exactly the same. Those are factory Toyota bushings, so they're exactly equivalent. They go back into the holes on the body, and then there's a metal collar that sits inside the bushings where the bolt rides on. That went in pretty easy, and just a little bit of tapping to get it all seated and all the collars lined up there. Then the new bolts and shackles go in. The longer bolt goes on top, obviously, and this is how they were from the factory, with the bolts facing out, the top bolts facing out and the rear bolts facing in. So that's exactly how I put them back on, and it fits up really good. They're a lot heavier and beefier than the old ones, and you can see the distance there, even to the first hole, compared to where they were coming off. And I'm going to use the middle hole, and if that causes any issues, I can always drop it down to that top hole. Moving to the front spring bracket on the body, this bolt and nut was actually the easiest one to get off, but getting the spring out and back in this spot was the most difficult. With everything unbolted, I just pried down between the springs and the axle, and the whole spring pack just flipped down. Then I had to use a hammer and a bit of persuasion to get this one out. That one at the front was the tightest one, tightest fitting, hardest to get out. I fabricated a small jig to help me press these bushings out, and without a hydraulic press like this would have been impossible to do. I've seen instances where people will burn them out with a torch, do all sorts of crazy stuff, but it's just not possible without a tool like this. So if you don't have a way to press these in, or if you don't have a shop you can take them to get pressed in, I'd recommend not even doing this yourself. Just take it somewhere and get it done. It'll be way faster, way easier, probably way less money. But I've got the press, so I press these out very carefully so that nothing goes flying, because there's a lot of pressure under there. And trying a little bit of PB Blaster, maybe that'll help, I'm not sure. But those have been in there a long time, and they're pretty tight, they're kind of rusted. So it's a tremendous amount of force right there, you can't even tell. There's the old bushing. It doesn't even look that bad. The rubber and everything's pretty good, but of course I'm going to replace it. And there's one of the new ones. Get it set up. And this thick-walled piece of pipe was just the perfect size to push it in. I lined it up the best I could to get it seated and just went really slowly. Work it in a little bit at a time. And that worked really well to push it in. Extremely well. And it's even on both sides. Really nice fit. Very happy with that. And I've cleaned up the shock mount on that U-bolt seat just with a hand file, because of how it was. I couldn't really get any tools in there, but I just cleaned it up a bit, and I'll put some anti-seize on when I put that shock back in. So just using a small floor jack, I put the spring pack onto the seat, and I'm jacking them both together towards the axle and trying to get it centered on that little pin. And there's about a 1/2 inch or 5/8 hole on that U-bolt seat that needs to go up into that. I guess it's a bolt or a pin on the bottom of the spring pack. And once it's in place, I'll just run those bolts in a little bit to get it hanging there, and then use that same floor jack to push up on this one and get that hole lined up using the hammer. And it was really, really tight going up against the body there. Like I said, that was the hardest one to take off and to put back on. But using the jack and a hammer, I was able to get it lined up pretty good and get that bolt in. I tapped it lightly with the hammer, but it was already lined up, so I was careful not to mess up the threads on the other side. And that nut goes on nice and easy. Then I'll snug these up, and it squares everything and centers everything. And put this over on the other side so I can attach it later. And then as I let the jack down, the end of the spring comes down and I can see where to line it up into which hole. And I'm going to put it in the center. I think that'll give me enough lift, almost a full 2 inches. And I don't want to go crazy and put it on the third one on the bottom and make it too high. From what I understand, there can be issues with the drive shaft and the U-joints, so I'm just going to play it safe and put it in the middle and see how it goes. So jack it back up and get that tire back on. And tighten up all the nuts and bolts on the shocks. Put that little retaining bracket for the emergency brake cable back in. Those two 12mm. And let the whole thing down. I torqued these up. I think there's 90 on there. I think it's 90 foot-pounds. I can't remember. I had the original specs. I looked up the specs for the factory bolts, and I actually stripped out one of these bolts for the aftermarket lift brackets. Maybe it's not the same quality. Maybe I misunderstood the specs, but tried to tighten them out. I stripped one off, so luckily I had an old bolt. One of the old bolts and nuts survived, so I was able to reuse that. This one here I actually stripped out. So I think I ended up just putting 90 foot-pounds on everything. And with the lift installed, I've got about 2 inches of lift, just under, maybe 1.75 inches. And with the axle being further from the body, I now need to raise up the brake proportioning valve. So I did that just using a piece of flat bar, welded 2 nuts on it, and lifted that up 2 inches to account for that. And that's it. There's the old height, kind of squatted out. It's not a drastic amount of lift, but it makes a big difference to how this van sits and the amount of clearance I've got. So we're ready for an adventure now.